A peculiar building once sat atop Gamble's Hill in Richmond. Its construction was the lifetime achievement of a man whose artistic talent contributed to Virginia's rich cultural heritage in a multitude of ways. And long after he died, his noteworthy creation would live on and evolve for many decades as one of the River City's most beloved landmarks. Perhaps antebellum Richmond's most eccentric citizen was British native William Abbott Pratt. He was an early master of photography, specializing in daguerreotype and ambrotype, and established a studio and gallery in Richmond in 1846. Pratt's gallery initially moved around several addresses on Main Street, but by the early 1850s, the gallery had settled in a building at 145 Main Street, today on the 1200 block of East Main Street. The building's facade was remodeled to exude Pratt's love of all things Gothic, and became known around the city simply as the Gothic Window for its intricate bay. In 12 years, Pratt's studio produced more than 30,000 images of people from various walks of life. His most noteworthy images are undoubtedly those of the now famous writer Edgar Allan Poe. Having begged Poe to sit for a portrait for some time, Pratt finally caught the author walking past the studio one day in September 1849. History has come to regard the two modest images produced that day as the most genuine likenesses of one of America's most celebrated writers. They would also prove to be the last images of Poe, who died unexpectedly only 3 weeks later. Business by the early 1850s was steady for Pratt, who by this time had decided to build for himself a new home atop Gamble's Hill on the western edge of Richmond. Completed in 1853, the house was inspired by the grand estates of Pratt's Scottish relatives, particularly Cluny Castle in Aberdeenshire, but in miniature. Meticulously designed with Scotch baronial elements, the facade of the castle was a clever illusion, for only the foundation was made of stone. The rest of the house was framed in wood, and covered in rolled sheet metal supplied by Tredegar Iron Works at the foot of Gamble's Hill. The sheet metal was then painted to resemble stone. Inside, the roughly 5,000 square foot castle had 20 rooms across 4 levels. Pratt decorated the interior with as much panache as the exterior. No 2 rooms had the same ceiling height. The drawing room featured 4 stained glass windows imported from France, depicting each of the 4 seasons. The beamed ceiling in this room was painted with eye-catching heraldic emblems set behind glass panels. Another room on the first floor, with an imposing Gothic fireplace called the Park Room, overlooked Gamble's Hill Park and the James River. A wrought iron spiral staircase occupied the principal tower, but it wasn't the only way to move about the castle. Pratt also incorporated a number of hidden passageways and secret staircases. Among them was a tunnel leading from a self-described dungeon in the basement down to the river. In one secret passageway, one could discreetly peer through the eyes of a painting into the room below. Richmond's well-to-do would promenade on summer evenings through this part of the city, hoping to catch a breeze on Gamble's Hill that might break the stifling humidity. During the early years of the Civil War, the castle notably hosted Confederate General Charles Henningsen for a time. But the war would change Richmond forever. On April 2, 1865, the Union Army broke through the Confederate line at Petersburg and began marching toward Richmond. Sensing that the fall of Richmond was imminent, President Davis and his cabinet fled the capital. Troops were instructed to set fire to tobacco warehouses to prevent their contents falling into enemy hands. The flames quickly raced out of control and consumed more than 30 blocks of the city's commercial district, including the beloved Gothic window on Main Street. Escaped prisoners sabotaged the city's firefighting equipment, and roads were clogged as soldiers, carriages, and pedestrians struggled to evacuate Richmond. Pratt's castle glowed a dull orange that night, as the burning city below descended into anarchy. The castle was fortunately spared from destruction during the chaotic evacuation of Richmond. After the smoke settled, a photographer clambered up one of the castle's towers to capture a panoramic image of Richmond's burnt-out commercial district. Parts of this photograph have been widely reproduced in history books ever since. Conversely, the castle itself also appears in a number of other images taken around the remains of downtown Richmond. From down in Shockoe Bottom, and as far away as Church Hill, the stalwart castle could be seen peering above the devastation. Pratt sold his cherished castle later that year and left Richmond forever, where he finished his days at Walnut Grove, another home of historic value in its own right, in Stuart's Draft. A man of many firsts, Pratt's talent for design earned him the honor of being hired as the University of Virginia's first superintendent of buildings and grounds. He was responsible for drafting a plan to improve the campus grounds and added new buildings, including the nation's first purpose-built college infirmary. The University of Virginia's archives still retain Pratt's proposal for a magnificent Gothic chapel on campus that was never built. As Richmond rebuilt itself in the years following the Civil War, the castle was rented for a number of years until it was purchased by Samuel and Henrietta Cornick in 1880. Henrietta was the daughter of Joseph Mayo, who had been mayor of Richmond during the war. As mayor, he coordinated relief efforts after the horrendous evacuation fire in 1865 and worked with the Union Army to restore order in Richmond during the Union occupation. Having been molded by the hardship of the war years, Henrietta saved everything, filling the castle with old stockings, coffee pots, and various other items. After the Cornicks died in 1904, auctioneers opened the castle to a curious public who swarmed in with zeal to see the famous home. The next owners were Mr. and Mrs. Joseph F. Biggs, who filled the castle with antiques and souvenirs from their trips abroad. Their menagerie of antiques included a 10-foot-tall mirror once owned by Thomas Jefferson, and the table upon which General Cornwallis supposedly signed Britain's surrender at the end of the American Revolution. The Biggs family would own Pratt's Castle for nearly 40 years. During their time here, they would occasionally open the castle for tours, which always generated enthusiastic crowds from across the city. At times, the enigmatic castle was just as mysterious to its owners as it was to the public. In the early 1930s, the Biggs discovered a small, dark room in the basement near the kitchen. Inlaid in the middle of its concrete floor was a single, curiously placed brick. The concrete floor in one spot gave forth a hollow sound when tapped, indicating the presence of some sort of open space beneath the floor. It is not clear if the question of what lay beneath the castle's basement was ever answered, or if the original purpose of the mysterious room itself was ever clarified. In 1942, Pratt's Castle once again came into the ownership of a Scotsman. Dr. James Galloway, a well-known veterinarian in Richmond, purchased the home with the same sense of ancestral pride that once inspired William Pratt himself to build it. Ancestral pride may not have been enough to keep the castle running, for less than 3 years later, Dr. Galloway put the landmark up for sale. In the autumn of 1945, Reynolds Metals rented the castle from a local agent. The company used it to house a group of 25 young foremen from Mexico, whom they sought to train on site in preparation for a new plant opening in Mexico City. At 4 a.m. on December 10th, the foremen were awoken from their slumber by the smell of smoke. A fire was sweeping through the upper floors of the castle. Fortunately, all of the men escaped without injury, but the flames roared from the castle's principal tower for more than 3 hours while firefighters battled the blaze. By sunrise, the flames had been extinguished, although a significant portion of the castle's interior had been gutted. Some treasures, like the wrought iron spiral staircase, were fortunately salvageable, and soon after restored. The castle's next owner was interior decorator Dorothy Horn, who lived in the castle and operated her studio on the first floor. Dorothy had spent a great deal of energy rehabilitating the castle by the time she was married there in November 1949. Afterward, the castle passed into the ownership of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Adair in the spring of 1950, after closing for the handsome sum of $25,000. The Adairs, or perhaps Dorothy Horn, subdivided part of the castle into apartments, the income from which supplemented maintenance costs. Mrs. Adair operated a ceramics studio in the basement, where she often gave classes. She also demonstrated for one journalist a secret compartment in the floor of the castle's drawing room called the Wishing Well. For years, visitors were encouraged to whisper a wish, drop a penny into the compartment, and leave with the assurance that their wish would come true. Mrs. Adair donated the pennies collected in the box to the local children's hospital. Yet again, Pratt's castle was subjected to another devastating fire in the winter of 1951, when the furnace in the basement malfunctioned. Fortunately, the fire department saved the castle, just as they had 6 years earlier, but by the 1950s, the neighborhood of Gamble's Hill had changed. No longer was it the fashionable West End address of the great and the good. Many of Richmond's grand old homes along Gamble's Park had fallen into disrepair. Time and successive renovations had also robbed Pratt's castle of its original luster as well, for by now much of its crenellated battlements, its turrets, and many other decorative ornaments had been removed. Talk of redeveloping Gamble's Hill was well underway. A number of proposals were put forth that would have redeveloped the neighborhood with modern housing while still retaining Pratt's castle as a centerpiece of the neighborhood. The efforts of preservationists were matched by equally determined parties who had little interest in preserving the castle. Local insurance agent William Farrell purchased Pratt's castle in the spring of 1954 with the expectation of being permitted to rezone the property for use as an insurance office. The Planning Commission and the Central Richmond Association ultimately refused to rezone the property. Mr. Farrell publicly accused the Central Richmond Association of attempting to keep property values in Gamble's Hill unnaturally depressed in order to make it easier for a combine to purchase property more cheaply, which in turn would encourage redevelopment of the historic neighborhood into modern apartments that could be rented for personal profit. Preservationists continued fighting for the castle until 1957, when its entire block was purchased by the Albemarle Paper Manufacturing Company. The company claimed they initially intended to restore the castle, but its heavy risk of fire, to say nothing of the expense of restoration, were ultimately prohibitive. President Walter Craigie of the Central Richmond Association, who encouraged redevelopment in Gamble's Hill, likewise did not mince words when he categorized Pratt's castle as a structure that has neither historical significance or beauty. The wrath of the wrecking ball could be avoided no longer, and demolition finally commenced. A handful of window frames ultimately found their way to the Valentine Museum, where they remain in storage in the museum's collection today. By the spring of 1958, one of Richmond's most endearingly eccentric curiosities, which had been an intimate part of the city's cultural fabric for more than 100 years, was gone forever.